Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we're actually talking about Apple because Apple's app tracking feature, basically allowing you to opt out of app tracking, isn't working so well. Wow, here's what's going on. It's coming from the Washington Post. Now, if you didn't know, on your iPhone, you can now tap a button that says Ask App Not to Track, but behind the scenes, many apps keep on going. They keep on tracking. Now, say you open the app Subway Surfer, which is the example from the Washington Post. This app is listed as the App Store's must-play game, or at least one of their must-play games, and it asks you if you're okay with the app tracking you. That's a question iPhone started displaying this past April as part of the privacy crackdown by Apple against apps from basically tracking you. Now, saying no is supposed to stop the app, such as Subway Surfers and Facebook, for example, from learning about what you are doing in other apps and what other websites you're going to. But something curious actually happens if you ask it not to be tracked, according to an investigation by researchers at the privacy software maker Lockdown and also the Washington Post. Subway Surfers, the app, starts sending an outside ad company known as Chartboost29, very specific data points about your iPhone, including your internet address, your free storage, your current volume level to 3 decimal points, and even your battery life up to 15 decimal points for some reason. Now, it's this kind of unique data, rather, that could be used by advertisers to identify your iPhone, possibly letting them know what other apps you use or how to target you for advertising. In other words, it's sidestepping your request to be left alone. It's sidestepping you saying do not track, and you can't stop it, and your privacy is worse off for it because you think that you're not being tracked, and sure enough, here we are. Now, Apple's rules say that apps aren't allowed to track people who say that they don't want it. But why is this happening? Privacy advocates say this kind of data gathering is likely tracking. It's just by a different name known as fingerprinting, and we will basically get into that. Now, and to quote, our investigation found the iPhone's tracking protections are nowhere nearly as comprehensive as Apple advertising might suggest. The Washington Post and Lockdown found 3 popular iPhone games share a substantial amount of information, identifying information with ad companies, even after they have been told not to track. And when they flagged those findings to Apple said that it was reaching out to these companies to understand what information they were collecting and how they were sharing it. After several weeks, nothing appears to have changed, at least according to the Washington Post. Now, Apple's so-called App Tracking Transparency Initiative has prompted big app makers such as Facebook and Zynga, they're the large game developer, to complain that this could hurt their overall profits. But that doesn't mean that they've really stopped tracking at all. And to find out what happens when you tap Ask Not to Track, Lockdown says it tested 10 popular apps running on basically an iPhone running iOS 14.8, and then they did it again with the newest iOS 15, analyzing what personal information was essentially flowing out of your phone. Now, Lockdown found most of the apps continue to communicate behind the scenes with basically a whole bunch of third-party data companies that privacy advocates are basically calling trackers. You've probably never heard of most of these before, but you can receive a flood of information from your iPhone, potentially revealing how you use your apps and even your location. Their uses for this data could be benign, like helping the app find bugs and track how well the design works, or they could be feeding your information to advertisers and data brokers, some of which we have seen massively hit and dumped out this kind of information in the dark web, Apollo.io being one of those. Now, among the apps that Lockdown investigated, basically tapping the Don't Track button made no difference at all to the total number of third-party trackers the apps actually reached out to. It did nothing. It absolutely did nothing. And the number of times the apps attempted to send out data to these companies declined by just 13%, which means 87% of the time, it works 100% of the time. Now, even more worrisome for consumers, Lockdown says, 3 of these apps that it investigated, Subway Surfers, which we talked about, Streamer Life, and Run Rich 3D, appear to be collecting data that could be used for the more invasive kind of fingerprinting or tracking known as digital fingerprinting, which I mentioned before. Now, fingerprinting happens when an app takes innocent-looking but technical information from your iPhone, like the volume, the battery level, the IP address of it, and more, and combine all of these details to create a picture of your phone that can be basically as unique as a fingerprint. Hence, digital fingerprinting, meaning I have the same iPhone as you, and my battery life is consistently different than yours, my volume is different than yours, my location, my address, all these kinds of things, and so they know your iPhone is not mine, even without the actual identifiers in it. So, from this same test phone, all three of these games that Lockdown tested sent Ad Network Chart Boost nearly the exact same array of device-specific data points. An Ad Network, for the record, is a company that serves as a broker between publishers and advertisers. All three also sent ultra-specific characteristics of the test iPhone to an ad company called Vungle. That's like jungle with a V. Now, that could allow app makers and advertisers to connect the dots and actually start tracking you without your consent. Remember, you tapped do not track, and here we are. Now, Apple says that fingerprinting iPhones has long been against its rules, but it's hard to forbid tracking when there's little agreement on what tracking even means. Now, many iPhone owners might assume that it means an app tracking your data in some way, perhaps including your location. Privacy advocates argue tracking can happen anytime on an app or website when it shares your personal information with a third party without your expressed and informed consent. It's one more company or so that could leak or misuse your data, or one recent example of this would be a Catholic priest who was outed as gay, most likely because the data that his phone was sending to a third party from the app Grindr essentially outed him. This is what we're talking about here. So Apple applies a more narrow definition of tracking. Their definition is simply this: the process of connecting information collected about you on one company's app or website with information collected by different companies, and only for the purposes of ad targeting, ad measurement, or sale to data brokers. It excludes sharing data for other purposes, such as analytics and fighting fraud. Now, some in the app industry are promoting their own definitions of tracking while seeing how far they can bend the one that essentially Apple has established for the developers. That's because basically for apps to rely on ads, Apple's tracking protections are bad news. Advertisers don't want to pay if there isn't proof that their ads are actually getting to the people that are downloading the apps and watching them. Why would I pay to basically target some kind of demographic in your app and pay well for it if I don't think it's getting there? And that's the whole problem that we have here, is that we have exploded a complete industry since essentially the dawn of social media, and Google even, that gives us things for free in exchange for giving out information. That is the entire point. You download an app for free, you might have to pay for in-game things, but if you never pay for anything on that, it is still sending data back continuously to advertiser brokers like this that are going ahead and selling your information, and that's how they're making money. That's how they are monetizing these kinds of things. Smaller developers also input or insert things like Facebook and Google trackers into their apps because Facebook and Google will pay for those kinds of things as well. But the biggest problem that I have here with this whole thing, because we know this kind of stuff goes on, is Apple. Apple has consistently failed to live up to marketing claims. I remember back in the day, I've mentioned them before, I'm a Mac, Justin Long, I'm a PC, John Hodgkins, I believe his name is, if I remember correctly. And they would say things like, oh, well, John Hodgkins would the PC would get infected, but Justin Long, the Mac, would never get infected. We can infect Macs all the time. We can infect iPhones all the time. We can infect iPads all the time. Look at the latest Pegasus vulnerability by the NSO group that was going on for years that Apple just found, basically made news and break. They also had essentially a app health score or privacy score that was compared to the nutrition label on the side of a cereal box. And then we find out that's on your honor. So you're giving Apple is giving you, as an Apple user, a false sense of security. You're clicking do not track and you think you're safe. You're reading the app's privacy score, not realizing it's not filled out by Apple. It's not reviewed by a third party. It's on your honor from the developer themselves. And I could be the shadiest developer on the planet and say, yes, private, I don't track. And until the Washington Post finds me, I've got your data coming and going, and I don't care what you're tapping. That's a huge problem. And so part of this is actually making products that do what you're going to say. If it doesn't track, it doesn't track. And Apple needs to be on this, but they also know that if they are, they're going to start losing revenue, because basically the game developers are going to say, well, I'm going to move exclusively to Google then, because why waste my time going to Apple when nobody's actually just going to let me track them? These are things that we really have to discuss. These are things that we have to understand, but it also means that we have to create a new economy for big tech. If the only way they are getting paid is by data mining us because we're the product to sell to advertisers who will then go ahead and sell us or try to sell us things that we want, so we'll spend money there, there are serious flaws for our privacy going forward in the future, and that's something that has to be addressed. The next economy, the next internet economy 2.0 has to address these problems so we don't have billion-dollar, trillion-dollar corporations essentially using us for their profitability without giving us any recourse whatsoever. And as I sit here recording this, on a computer or an Android phone or an iPhone or all of these kinds of things, I'm constantly being monitored. I'm constantly being tracked. As you're watching me, YouTube and Google know exactly what you're doing, or maybe you're watching it on LinkedIn. LinkedIn now knows too, which means Microsoft knows. These are things that we don't consider, but these are things that are all around us. And if we don't get a handle on this, it's only going to get worse. And that spells real, honest death of privacy, level things, especially when the governments get involved and say, hey, I want a copy of that too. And it's not just a request, it's an order. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, where you will be tracked for the record. And please feel free to subscribe to me to the tracking website, YouTube. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please stay as private as possible. Thanks.